Greetings and bienvenue, midnight crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Hi, X. Long-time lurker. I've been meaning to share a story from my childhood with you all for a while. Due to laziness mostly, I never got around to it. However, something that occurred recently got me in the mood. I am not pre-typing anything, so if there is a delay in between posts, it's because of that. Whether people show interest or not, I will write out the whole thing. Due to the absolute status of X nowadays, I won't be surprised if this gets buried. Also, let me preface by saying this: the story is not from my point of view. At all. I didn't experience any of the things that I'm about to type out. These are all accounts of family members over the course of 4 nights. Nights which I somehow slept through. However, there will be one thing in here that I did experience, which is what my family tells me. In my mind, it wasn't scary in any way, and to this day, I stand by what I saw to be true and that my family members were just rattled up by the event preceding it. But instead of boring you any further, I'll just get to the story. I will greentext where needed so that it's easier to read. Hey, it's tradition, right? Also, please forgive any inconsistencies or grammatical errors. It's 2:30 a.m. at night and most of this is taken from accounts of 7 other people. I'll start by laying down some groundwork for this story. Whilst I live in Canada now, I was born and partially raised in Bangladesh. For those who don't know, Bangladesh, India and Pakistan used to essentially be one big-ass country under British regime until they buggered off and let the locals break the country up into India and Pakistan. Bangladesh, known as East Pakistan before its independence. It's southeast of India, right next to Calcutta. We speak Bengali, carried over from there. However, due to being under Pakistani control, most of us are Muslims. This will become relevant later. If you think India is a shithole, it ain't got nothing on Bangladesh. Be me, 6 to 7 years old. Late 90s. City kid and city family, modern values. I'm basically part of the first generation in my family to not be born in the bumfuck rural villages. Emphasizing the fact about being a city kid, since rural and city folks in Bangladesh are basically completely different people. City folks are the middle-class modern people who have actual toilets and get to go to schools and shit, whereas the rural villagers are mostly poor folks, lower class. Almost 3/4 of people are illiterate and can barely afford to live. Different people means different values, different upbringings, etc. Although my own family are city folk, we have lots of rural relatives. These relatives are well off due to their relevant professions. Doctors, professions, businessmen and shit. Some of them even managed to build a modern apartment complex in the rural parts. Back to the story, my senpai gets invited to visit the new apartment they built. Excited by this, we went to check this building out. At this point, I'm going to ruin everything by saying that this apartment has no relevance to the story, at least not until later when it inadvertently became a safe house for us. These relatives live in Barisal, one of the southern cities of Bangladesh. We go to visit the new building, and everything is cool. Rural relatives had a bunch of kids my age, so we played a lot. I was an only child until my mom remarried, so it was always fun to hang with these kids. Our plan was to stay for 7 days and return back to Dhaka, the capital, which is where I lived. On the 3rd day, my mom tells me that we'll be visit another place and stay there for the next 4 days. Visibly bummed because I won't get to play with the kids anymore. I asked her where we were going. She said that my great-grandmother, from my grandpa's side, got word that we were visiting. She wanted us to spend some time at her place too. So on the 4th day, we set off to her place. At this point, I really should elaborate on my great-grandparents and their abode that we were invited to. Great-grandpa was basically the most famous doctor of the region. Great guy too apparently, since he used to give treatment and meds out for almost nothing. Revered by most of the locals and heralded as a savior of sorts. Due to this, was pretty much loaded. Never knew him personally, on the accounts that he died way before I was even born. Great-grandma on the other hand, is a mystery to me. I barely knew her. My 7 to 8-year-old mind barely remembered her, as most my visits to Barisal were confined to visiting the family of my great-grandmother from my grandma's side, who were the ones that built the apartment complex. Continuing with the actual story. The place we got invited to is very similar to Pick related. Basically 2 stories tall. First floor was used mostly as a dining room and quarters for servants. Second floor had the big-ass bedrooms. And one fuck-off huge living room, which was directly connected to the balcony. Balcony and living room were separated via wooden doors. Unlike Pick related, the balcony of our mansion had no roof above it. It just extended out of the mansion. For some reason that won't become clear until later on, not everyone from the original group of visitors went to the mansion. The group that went to the mansion were as follows. Me, my mom, her sister's husband, another aunt and 3 of my younger uncles. Barring my mom, mostly younger folks. Basically in their early 20s. We set off and get there and are greeted by the family of Grandpa's brother. We get invited in, get acquainted and shit. Being Bengali, we brought a shit ton of gifts and food for them. Tradition and shit. Always bring something for the people that invite you, etc. Great-grandma joins us later after having done her prayers. Comes up to me and basically sits me with her and speaks to me.
Do you remember me? You've gotten so much older.
The shit you hear from a family member who wasn't seen you in a while. Find it annoying due to being a petulant child and just duck and cover behind my mom. Should clarify that I did not find her creepy at all. I just hated it when people I barely knew got too friendly. They say children have some kind of sixth sense bullshit and can sense bad mojo or something, but I got nothing of the sort from her. Which is surprising considering what I was told about her in the later years of my life. Going to give a little information on my great-grandmother. She was, at the time I met her, somewhere in her 80s. At least, that's what her documented age is. She was definitely doing well for someone her age. She barely looked older than my actual grandmother. She lived as a widow after my great-grandpa's death, since apparently widows aren't allowed to remarry for some reason. Anywho, she was a mysterious woman, which leads me to think that the description I got of her from my mother once I entered my teen years were somehow created due to the mysterious air great-grandma had around her. She apparently raised djinns. Like, raised them from child into adulthood. Now, what the fuck is a djinn? They're spirits, created by Allah, as another form of life or some BS. Basically, non-human. Not ghosts. Though just like humans, there are good ones and bad ones apparently. The bad ones are the ones that get labeled as demons, but even the good ones can be mischievous. But yeah, apparently she raised these fuckers. This wasn't just my mother's impression of her. Most of my family, including the ones from Barisal, were and are still aware of this fact. I once asked my grandpa about this, since she is his mother and all. Expected him to dismiss this, but even he agreed to it. Obviously, I didn't know this or was even told of this prior to the visit. Who the fuck wants to tell a 8-year-old that the huge mansion he'd be staying in was also home to supernatural entities? Though, the following does make me question the process of the people who brought along an 8-year-old during their expedition. Whilst my mom was telling teenage me about great-grandma and her otherworldly kin, I asked her why the hell she went there if she knew of this fact. She told me that my aunt's husband, who was with us during our initial visit to the apartment complex, was told of the stories of great-grandma and was adamant about visiting the place. For convenience's sake, I'm going to call my aunt's husband, T was a Bengali man, but was raised in the USA. He basically doesn't believe in the paranormal. Dismisses it, like any sound-minded individual would. So, when he heard about this, he was hooked and wanted to see it firsthand. My aunt, let's call her S, on the other hand, was not at all for this. She claims that she was haunted by ghosts for a long time and suffered a lot of night terrors during her teen years. Her stories are also something I can discuss after this one, if people are interested in them. Should also mention that S and T were newlyweds. Like, they got married just a few months before the visit. T basically forced his decision to go visit the mansion onto S, since S didn't want to upset her new husband. My second aunt, who I'll call A, along with my mother, decided to not let them go alone and tagged along, mostly for Aunt S's sake. Along the way, 3 of my uncles also got wind of the paranormal mansion. They tagged along because they were young and rebellious and did not believe supernatural shit. Our posse is now at the mansion. We are having dinner in the dining room. Dining room is also connected to the kitchen. Kitchen, and by connection, dining room, faces these 3 sets of windows that look out towards a semi-forested area behind the mansion. To clarify, it isn't a full forested area. It's basically a garden, but it isn't tended to. Basically, weeds, grass, bushes and a shit ton of coconut and mango trees. Not dense enough to block out the sun during the day, but dense enough to be fucking spooky at night. We get done eating and move back up to the 2nd floor. There are 4 major bedrooms on this floor. One is occupied by my great-grandma's son and wife. One is for great-grandma herself. One was given to the newlyweds and had a smaller balcony attached to it. Last one was given to the 3 younger uncles, as they liked to stay up later. My mom, myself, and my aunt were given futons. I say futons, but there were literally just some blankets on the floor, in the living room. For some odd reason, there was also a smaller dining table in one corner of the living room. I think it might have been put there for the Ramadan season. You see, during Ramadan, you basically eat before the sun comes up, around 4 to 5 a.m. in the morning, and then fast the rest of the day until the sun sets. Since this eating is more of a formality than an actual full-sized meal, at least that's how it was for us, I guess it was more convenient to have a table up here to eat off of, instead of clambering downstairs at dawn. Next to the table were some wall decorations, including a portrait of William Shakespeare of all people. Here's a crude drawing of the layout of the 2nd floor in top-down view. Also, from here on out, all spooky going-ons will be accounts from those who were involved, as I somehow managed to sleep through all 4 nights of paranormal activity. First night, everyone goes to bed. It's later on during the night, somewhere around 2 to 3 a.m. Aunt S wakes up to scratching noises. Due to her previous experiences, she is freaked out by this. She woke up T, who saw how shaken she was. She asks him if he hears it too. He does, and realizes it's coming from the balcony door. Him being him, he thinks it's a branch or some shit and tells her to go to sleep. She insists that he go check it out. He gets out of bed and goes to the balcony door. Unlike most stories, where when a person gets close enough to the source of spooky antics it just stops, the scratching kept going until the very moment he opened the balcony door. He opens it. Nothing there. Not a single branch or shrub is close enough to the door to make the scratching noises. Supposedly, he was spooked by it but convinced my aunt that it was perhaps the door settling in the cold of the night. He shuts the door and gets back to the bed. My Aunt S is now in full spooked mode. Tells him it was a bad idea to come here. He tells her to relax and they both lay down again. Few minutes later, scratching starts again. This time, my uncle runs to the door and opens it. Still nothing. He peered over and realized there is a window to my uncle's room. He apparently went over to their room to scold them because he thought they were trying to spook him out, but none of them had ever opened the window. T calls BS and opened the window himself to try. The balcony was way out of reach for any of them to pull that off, lest they climbed out. Basically Metal Gear Solids their way to the balcony, scratched at the door and managed to return within the span of a few seconds. T doesn't mention his experiment to S, since she would just shit her pants and leave. They both decided to stay up until it was time for the Ramadan breakfast thing. My mom, the three uncles, T, S and second aunt all sat at the secondary table. I am still asleep at this point. I used to be a heavy sleeper and could sleep through anything. The gang is eating and whatnot, when T notices a severely distressed look on Aunt S's face. She went white and kept giving a 1,000-yard stare at the William Shakespeare portrait. T shakes S out of it and asks her WTF she was doing. If you didn't realize by now, the guy was and in a way still is douchey to this day. She then tells everyone to look at the portrait. At this point, everyone realized that the portrait of William Shakespeare looked fucking pissed off. My mom described it as such. We don't know for sure if the picture was originally drawn that way, or if it was like that when we even arrived. But at that time, in our eyes, the man in the picture looked angry. Supposedly, S stood up and moved around the room, only to realize that the eyes followed her around. Though, only she seemed to see that. The others, whilst saw the anger in the picture, didn't have the eyes follow them around. Aunt S was far too spooked out to sleep in the bedroom, and resorted to sleeping with my mom and the other aunt in the living room, sandwiching herself in between the two. T apparently went back to the room and slept alone, but once he heard the scratching noise again, came to the living room. This was night 1. Night 2 story upcoming. Night 1 ends, day 2 begins. First thing everyone does is go check the portrait. No anger, just a standard face. Eyes didn't follow anyone. Everyone, except the three uncles, collectively shits a tiny brick, but chalk it up to being awake at such a weird hour. Three uncles, who did see the pissed off Shakespeare, laughed it off. Started making fun of T as well for leaving the room at night. I am awake, we have breakfast and shit. See great-grandma, talk to her for a bit. Getting used to being around her. She was super nice, asked that her son bring some of her grandson's toys around for me to play. Bunch of cool-ass cars, including a black sports car with pop-up headlights. Just typing this out reminded me of something that I never thought about until now. The car had no batteries, and there were no batteries in the house. I still played with it, and kept manually pulling up the headlights, but they'd fall back down because no batteries. I distinctly remember at some point I was playing with one of the other toys in the balcony. I set the black car down a little bit further away from me. The headlights of the car actually popped up and it moved around a bit. Like, legit moved, like it had batteries. It was one of those where the actual wheels aren't motorized, but there is a fifth wheel under the car that moved the toy around. The ones where if the car bumped into a wall, it would turn itself around and move away from whatever it was blocking. The car starts moving and there is an unmistakable glow from the headlights that popped up. The car moves, seemingly hits nothing, and then turns around, and repeats this 4 to 5 times. Then it dies down. At the time, the little old me brushed it aside as being a faulty toy, but right now, typing this, I realize that makes no sense. It's not like it even had dead batteries in the car that somehow magically pushed out enough charge. I remember opening the compartment and it being empty. Fast forward to the second night. The incident from the first night was somewhat blocked out of the minds of those involved. I get put to bed and fall asleep. At this point, there are two separate stories that converge into one. First one is from my mom's perspective. Mom, second aunt and I sleep in the living room. T and S somehow summon up the courage to sleep in the bedroom again. I don't know if they heard the scratching on any other night. Mom has never had a schedule for sleeping, so she stays awake a while. Three uncles had their bedroom door open and were playing cards. Should mention that the way we slept in the living room, Our feet were towards the wooden doors that separated the balcony from the living room. The doors themselves were shoddy and had major gaps even when closed. My mom looks up at the doors. She can see some of the dark night sky through the gaps in the doors. And also sees red eyes. She starts shitting a chimney, trying to tell herself that she's just hallucinating or something. There were several sets of red eyes, some higher up, some low to the ground. They couldn't have been animals, since the balcony was effectively on the second floor. No animal could have climbed up without making significant amount of noise. No sooner that she saw the eyes, there was commotion in the uncle's room. Two of them were freaking out and holding on to the third one, who was frozen in fear. The guy had gone white and didn't move at all. They had to drag the guy out the room and into the living room, where my mom and second aunt kept asking him WTF happened. Somehow, I was still asleep through this. The guy finally came to his senses after a while and said that whilst the three of them were playing cards, he was sitting with his back up to the window, which was shut behind him. He apparently heard this high-pitched, demonic laugh behind him that taunted him. It wasn't just wind or anything, it was taunting him. Now the second perspective is from the uncle who heard the laugh. Earlier that day, the three were fucking about on the roof of the house. The roof was huge and had a little outhouse of sorts that was used by the wife of my great-grandma's son for something. They were fucking about, smoking and shit. Discussing how ridiculous last night was, the Shakespeare thing. One of them, the one that got spooked, started taunting the spirits or whatever by yelling at them classic horror movie jackass move. Fast forward to night, they were playing poker or something in the room, having a grand old time. The one that yelled on the roof was sitting with his back to the shut window. The others were in front of him. The one that yelled thinks he hears something and perks up his ears. From behind the window, he hears this distinct laugh, followed by taunting. To this day, he hasn't described what the taunts were. My mom thinks it was most likely something along the lines of, "We exist, you shithead." The laughs sounded like cries of victory. Which makes sense, because by this point, he was completely paralyzed. He felt that he couldn't move at all. The two other uncles took notice of this. They dragged him out of the room and into the living room. Once he unfroze, he told everyone in the living room about the laugh. The two uncles, who didn't hear any of it, went to the window and opened it. Literally nothing there. In the layout I posted, their room, and the window, faced out towards a cricket field. There is no way to reach the window on the second floor, not even a balcony like the other room. They decided to not tell T&S about this during the Ramadan breakfast. Only to spare S, they don't even mention any of this to great-grandma and her senpai, fearing that it might offend her. She knew about her reputation of being known as the one that raises djinns, and the last thing my folks wanted to do is piss her off. Third day rolls around. No one wants to spend time in the house, so we all go out and visit the relatives at the apartment again. Under the pretense that there was a feast for us there for dinner that day. My uncles shared this story to the 20-year-olds there. They all confirm that the place is deaf, haunted, and that we shouldn't stay there any longer, as djinns, the bad ones, get worse and worse as time goes by. We reluctantly returned to the mansion that night. The deeper we got into the night, the more spooked we were getting. Everyone decided to sleep in the living room, because no one felt like being alone. I went to bed first, and managed to stay asleep again through the next set of events. Which is surprising considering the magnitude of what happened that night. Deep night comes and we are all asleep. When suddenly, loud fucking thumps start coming from the roof. Like, raining bricks and stones. Sounded like a fucking war. Everyone shot up from their sleep. Everyone except me, of course. The women start shitting themselves. The dudes are tactically shitting themselves, but get up and turn the lights on. The fucking hailstorm of bricks and stones keeps going. Great-grandma comes out of her room and takes one look at everyone there and says something. It sends chills down my spine and I wasn't even awake to hear this. I will go take care of it. I kid you not, she said that and apparently just walked up to the roof. The men there are shocked to hell by this, but are way too scared to go up after her. The rain of rock and debris on the roof kept going as she went up. They then heard one final smash. It fucking shook the entire house to its core. Enough to cause a few fixtures to fall of the walls. They even heard what sounded like little rocks that broke off of whatever large rock that fell down settling on the roof. Shit levels have now reached outer space. Great-grandma just casually comes down the stairs. Supposedly gave this knowing smile, said nothing and went back to her room. The crew just sat there, awed by what they just fucking witnessed. No one slept for the rest of the night. After the sun came up, the three uncles plus T decided to go check the roof. Pretty ballsy of them, even in broad daylight. They get to the roof and see a mess of broken stones and a shit ton of bricks. No fucking idea how they got there, since my three uncles were up there the day before and there definitely weren't any there. They find the big ass rock that caused the final smash. Fucking giant rock. Big enough to need people to live it. They go back downstairs, spooked to shit. Tell the women about this. T then asked the gals to stay there and took the three uncles upstairs. They start lifting some of the rocks and smashing them onto the roof. Including the big one, which two of them lifted as high as they could and dropped on the roof. They came back downstairs and asked the women if the sounds were similar. The women confirmed that whilst they heard what they were doing, it was nowhere near as loud as the night before. Everyone basically left first thing after I woke up. Never even explained to great-grandma and her family as to why we left. Spent the fourth day and night at the apartment building instead. Fourth day. After leaving the mansion, we're back at the apartment building, and the posse relates this story to the other folks. They weren't surprised at all. Spoopy happenings were par for the course for that mansion. I was glad to be back with the kids, but I did miss the toys back at the mansion. Distinctly remember asking my mom if I could take the black car with me before we left the mansion, but she didn't let me. In hindsight, it was probably the second wisest decision she made during the trip. Here's another detail that I should mention. The apartment complex was 7 stories high, and was one of the few tallest buildings around. The mansion was huge too. The two locations were separated by a few kilometers or so. Far enough for it to be unreasonable to walk, since it took a good hour or so. But, if you climbed up to the roof of the apartment building, you could actually see the mansion in the distance. Fourth night rolls around. Uncles, T, and a few of the other younger men in the family are smoking up on the rooftop. T and the uncles keep looking at the mansion, if only to remind themselves that they're as far away as they can be from that place. Eventually, they start making out these shapes on the roof of the mansion. They described it as shadows of praying mantis that were standing upright. They couldn't believe their eyes, so they asked the other men to look in that direction. They all calmly acknowledge that they see them too, and that it's just a common occurrence. T and the three stooges shit themselves and come back downstairs. They mentioned the shadows to the women of the posse. They obviously had zero intentions of going to the roof to look at it. One of the things the dudes mentioned was the size of the shadows. Even from the distance they were at, they looked unnaturally huge. Remember the outhouse I mentioned being on the rooftop of the mansion? It was at least 8 to 10 foot tall. The shadows had at least twice the height of the outhouse, if not taller. We left Barisal on the 5th day and went back to Dhaka. Everyone who went on the trip decided they would never go back to the mansion, ever again. T&S moved to the USA a few months later. My mom remarried and moved to Canada with me 2 years after. The second aunt and the spooked uncle, who I should have mentioned were siblings, but it wasn't too relevant to the story, moved to Australia of all places a few years after that. I was told these stories once I was a teenager in Canada. My Western-influenced brain dismissed all of it since I never experienced any of it, well, mostly any of it. My mom swears by it to this day. I contacted my aunts and their stories are consistent with that of my mom, which leads me to believe that they did experience something those nights. Their commonly shared belief is that the Djinns didn't appreciate us being there. They were kept at bay by my great-grandma, at least until she went to sleep herself. My mom thinks that the first night, it went after us because she had always had issues with night terrors and spooky stuff and was the most susceptible of the posse. I'm guessing they wanted to use her to drive the rest of us out. The Djinns were then doubly pissed off by the uncle that taunted them and attacked him the second night. Seeing that no one had left, they went into full frenzy the third night and decided to trash the roof. My great-grandma probably did something that night to calm them, but they succeeded in driving us out. I like to think that the shadows that my uncles and T saw on the fourth night were just the fuckers having a victory dance. Now, I did mention that there was one story that my family claims as paranormal, which I don't, in the first post of the thread. I still stand by the fact that it was real and that my family is just fucking with me to add it onto the pile of accounts that have already been made. Bear in mind that this whole time, I've been asleep through the things that happened during the night. My mom thinks I was unaffected because my great-grandma had a genuine liking of me, which probably means I was given some form of protection over whatever the hell was happening. This was either around day 1 or 2 at the mansion, I can't remember for sure. I have always been a rather forgetful person, and I barely remember most of my childhood. But I do remember the following. Be me. Bored from playing with toys. Decide to explore around the mansion. Go around the rooms. Eventually come to the stairway that leads to the roof. Decide to go upstairs. Hear someone call out from behind me when I'm halfway up the stairs. There's a teenage girl there, walking up behind me. Now, I want to add that to 7 and 8 Bengali me. This was a normal sight, as some of the servants of the mansion had kids of their own that would sometimes work there too. I assumed that whoever this person is was simply told by my mom to keep an eye on me as I went around the place. She didn't say anything after that, so both of us climbed up to the roof. I start running around, go after birds and shit that are there. The girl hangs around, keeping an eye on me. She's leaning against the railing of the balcony. I remember talking to her, but don't recall if she ever answered. I think she did, but I don't remember her voice. Hell, I don't even remember her face. I only remember that she wore a green salwar kameez. Eventually, I hear my mom calling me downstairs, so I just left. The girl never followed me downstairs. I completely forget about it for the next few years. This comes up when mom is telling me the stories later on. While my mom is telling me these stories, I told her how I never experienced any of them. Somehow, the talk of me being on the balcony came up. My mom said that I just disappeared during that day and came downstairs only after she yelled out to me a few times. She was surprised and worried that I went up by myself. She is always worried about me being on rooftops because when I was 2 or 3 years old, I apparently managed to leave the apartment building we lived at the time and climbed to the roof, where I apparently stood at the edge which had no railings. It took 3 adults to coax me back to them because I was taking 1 step closer to the rail-less edge for every 1 step the adults took to come closer to me. But that's irrelevant. Sorry, I tend to babble. But all that to say that she was protective of me and was scared of the prospect of me having been to the roof of the mansion alone. I told her that I wasn't alone because she had sent the girl to look after me. I wish I could describe the look my mom had after I told her that. She basically said that she never sent anyone to look after me, let alone even know where I was. I described the girl to her the best I could, and she said there was no one that young at the mansion at that time. I still have a hard time believing that since it could very well have been one of the servants' daughter who perhaps was only there that day and left afterwards. The girl didn't seem to be a menacing presence at all and didn't scare me in the least. TLDR, a posse of my family members went to a spooky mansion and got spooked. Also, badass great-grandma was badass. Now, the reason as to what motivated me to write this story is because of something that happened recently. Ironically, I'm no longer a heavy sleeper. My sleep cuts in and out during the night, but I can generally fall back asleep. For the last week, however, it hasn't been the case. The last week or so. Kept waking up in the middle of the night. Felt super uneasy every time I shut my eyelids to go back to sleep. Felt something jolt me awake every time. Basically woke up tired and sleepy every morning. Would come back home and be super sleepy, but still somehow wake up and have trouble going back to sleep. This goes on until Friday. Come back from work, tired due to lack of sleep. Decide to go see landlord in his shop. He has a coffee shop connected to the apartment building. Bear in mind that I did not at any point mention my sleeplessness to him. We're chill, so we talk about random shit. He suddenly brings up my downstairs neighbor. She lived right below my apartment. Apparently she's been going through depression. Landlord at some point visited into her apartment and found a knife next to her bed. Asked her about it, and she broke saying that she has been trying to self-end every night for the last week. Landlord calls 911 and gets her hospitalized. I come home and shit bricks. Then proceeded to have a good sleep. I wonder if her trying to self-end somehow manifested a sleeplessness in me. I'm not a psychic or sensitive to paranormal shit, if you couldn't already tell.
Fucking Djinns were looking out for you, dude. They hated your senpai, but were chill with you.
That's what my mom believes too. Like I said, great-grandma has a genuine liking of me, so she probably told them to stay the fuck clear of me.
Well, you said the mansion was quite big, so it's likely that it was a servant or a distant family member or something that was just walking around the mansion. Now you said that your great-grandmother was doing prayers. Which is strange because from an Islamic perspective most people consider summoning and communicating to jinn a form of seer, dark magic, and could even result in shirk, polytheism. Which, bear in mind, according to Islam, both witchcraft and polytheism are one of the biggest sins a person can commit. So it wouldn't make much sense in my mind for a religiously observant Muslim to talk to jinn or try to summon them. Did you happen to see your grandma doing her prayers? Did she do them in the traditional Muslim way or different? Like the actions and facing Mecca? I'm not well versed on Islam and mysticism in Islam, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong about anything.
I never saw her pray. It was off limits when she did her prayers. Her room was a mystery. It didn't have a traditional light source. Only had one red bulb and didn't have any windows to let in direct sunlight. Though she did leave her doors open during the daytime. I went in there and it had a big old-fashioned wooden bed and one dresser. Nothing out of the ordinary as far as little me could tell. If I remember correctly, she would always close her doors before whatever she did. I called it praying because that's what she told us she was doing. So who knows? So the second set of stories take place in the apartment I pretty much grew up in. It was in Dhaka, around an area known as Shahjahanpur. My Aunt S had a ton of issues with night terrors. Some of them can be explained away with stress. She was finishing uni at the time and most of her nightmares were probably caused due to those. Some, however, she claims took place whilst she was awake. One of the first stories I was made aware of concerned a mirror. This mirror apparently spooked the shit out of her when she woke up in the middle of the night. It hung near the wall that had the door to the room and basically faced the windows. She would always see shadows hovering outside the window. Keep in mind that we were on the third floor, and the windows faced a backyard, so there were no cars or lights there. She would see these fuck-off shadows and just close her eyes shut and pray until they were gone. The scariest one with the mirror is as follows. Aunt S wakes up in the middle of the night. By default, line of sight falls on the mirror as she wakes up. She sees what she explains as a floating sheet. Yes, a fucking floating sheet of all things, like Charlie Brown's Halloween costume. It was white and just floated around, it didn't seem to have a shape underneath it. She only saw it in the mirror, the thing wasn't physically there in the room. The fucking thing, or the reflection of the thing, I should say, starts to float out the windows. And flies off into the night sky. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. She had the mirror removed from her room. Funnily enough, it was placed in the hallway outside her room, and was brought back in the same place after she married and left for the States. More of her stuff to come. Her next two encounters could be explained away as either elaborate nightmares or sleep paralysis. She claimed that she knew what she saw was real. The first one involved pick-related. Middle of the night, Aunt wakes up, eyes still shut, feels a heavy burden on her chest. Having trouble breathing, opens her eyes. This fucking thing was sitting her chest, staring at her. I drew an approximation of it. She did a drawing herself afterwards, which she showed me. Unfortunately, her original drawing has been long lost to time. This thing is just 3 giant eyes glued together. Each eye had stick-like, almost vein-like legs jutting out of it. Almost looked like a spider. It just sits on her chest for what felt like forever. And then poof, it fucking disappears. Aunt S just sits up and wonders WTF happened. Second one involved William Shakespeare, and serves as the reason why she was so terrified of the portrait of him at the mansion. Her uni studies involve her reading about Shakespearean literature. Has to read his shit day and night. One night apparently, she woke up and saw a disembodied Shakespeare's head floating around her room. Naturally, she shits bricks. The head apparently glared at her and supposedly said angry things to her. Before it poofed away. Again, this one specially can be explained away as a nightmare, but she claims that she was wide awake when this happened. Why a fucking floating Shakespeare head, we still don't know to this day. Now, my mom claims she has had several spooky things happen to her at that apartment. My mom and I shared the room in between Aunt S's and my grandparents' room. It had an attached bathroom, and a door that led into the dining room. Whilst we had a bed in that room, she mostly slept on the floor because my mom liked hard floors over a soft mattress. I would mostly sleep on the bed. My mom claims that during the night, she would always have things scratching and clawing at her feet, enough to leave scars and shit. We can dismiss that as being bug bites and whatnot, but she says she knows the difference between a bug's bite and what felt like nails scratching at her feet. She believes that she has a djinn that follows her around. During her time in Bangladesh after I was born, she somehow got involved with this Hoosier, Islamic priest, and used to work for him. Stuff like raising money and attending seances and shit. I saw the guy once when she took me along to his mosque. The fucking place was lit though. Looked like a modern-day palace. Never liked the guy, seemed creepy but only because he looked like a Discord mod. Supposedly, one of the seances she was involved in caused her to quit. Seance with Hoosier. Everyone is sitting in this dark room. The Hoosier was reading his prayers. Suddenly, everyone starts feeling a presence. One of the doors opens up. A colossal shadowy figure was at the entrance. Then it was gone. Everyone in the room lost their shit. Apparently, the Hoosier summoned a djinn. Supposedly there are ways to summon one, and if things are done right, it can be made to do tasks that you assign to it. My mom quit being at the seances after that, but believes that one of the djinns may have followed her home and still follows her to this day. Here's the final story. It involves me. I was sleeping with mom on the floor in our room one day. I wake up during the wee hours of the morning. Sunlight was leaking into our room but hadn't quite reached the dining room. As seen in the plan above, our room had a door that faced the dining room and the dining table. This is what happened after I woke up. I am 6 or 7-year-old me. Kind of awake. Since I faced the door, my immediate line of sight was towards the dining room. See what looked like Mom was standing by the dining table. Call out to her, telling her to come back to bed. She turns around, and I catch sight of her. Completely black figure with 2 red eyes. Body somehow gaseous. Stupid me calls out to her a second time, asking her to come back to bed. Thing just stands there, glaring at me. It's only at this point that I realized that my mom was literally laying next to me this whole time. I look down at her and things finally click in my head. I looked back and the thing was gone. I shit myself and cuddled myself up to my mom and buried my face on her back and went back to sleep. I'm pretty sure it was just a vivid nightmare, but it felt so fucking real at the time. One of the uncles from the mansion trip, this happened a few years before the trip mind you, was actually there at the house that day. He was visiting and sleeping in the living room. In the morning, after everyone woke up, I went to ask him if he perhaps was the one I saw taking a stroll in the dining room, but he said he never went there. That's all I really have. I just wanted to share these with you all since X has provided me with some interesting reads over the years. If you all want to share stories or ask questions, please go ahead. I appreciate you all taking time to read these. Here's an addendum to the original story that I completely missed, even though I went into painstaking detail about the forested area around the kitchen. The mansion had servants. Not really butlers or maids, just servants. Fucked up system in Bangladesh that I won't get into, but it's pretty much glorified slavery. These servants were mostly confined to the lower floor. Some of them had their own smaller quarters, but a few of them had to sleep in or around the kitchen area. Which means that they basically were face to face with the windows pointing out to the greenery behind the mansion. If I remember correctly, the second day, after the Shakespearean horror of the night before, my aunt actively engaged in conversations with the servants who slept downstairs and asked if they ever noticed anything strange. Sure enough, they did. Shrubbery and trees would constantly move and rustle at night, without there ever being any noticeable wind. They described it as sounding like tigers jumping from tree to tree. They regularly saw red eyes staring at them at night. Would hear talking in some weird, unintelligible language. Would also hear shit going down on the roof, all the way from the bottom floor. The servants just lived with it because they had no other way to make money. They apparently would constantly pray when the shit happened. I can't imagine living like that honestly.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.